have a question and answer session at the end, but we're going to be doing the questions on cards. So everybody has cards at their seat. If you'll please take note of them. If you have a question, please write it down on the card to keep the conversation moving. We're going to try to look at as many cards as we can, synthesize the questions that are similar, and hopefully get to as many questions from the audience and online as we can while we have the governor for the limited amount of time. So if everybody is settled with their phones off, I'll give an introduction. So welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Kimberly Adams. I'm a correspondent at the public radio program Marketplace and a member of the club's Board of Governors. Tonight, we welcome former Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe to discuss his new book, Beyond Charlottesville, Taking a Stand Against White Nationalism.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, it's a topic that's particularly poignant after this weekend's shooting in El Paso, Texas. But going back, on the evening of August 12, 2017, a Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville of neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and right-wing militias turned violent, leading to the deaths of a counter-protester, Heather Heyer, and 2 state troopers. Then Governor McAuliffe, in a press conference, told the white supremacists to go home, that they were not welcome in the Commonwealth of Virginia. In the book, Governor McAuliffe gives readers a closer look at the events of that weekend almost 2 years ago, including his detailed account of the government's controversial response. He also explores Virginia's history of racism and the deeper problems that fuel the racial divides and the rise of white nationalism. And the book calls for Americans to confront the raw ingredients of racism that still fester. The governor told Newsweek magazine, quote, "As bad as Charlottesville was, it woke a lot of people up. Too many people in this country felt we had overcome the issues of racism. We had not. The images that came out of Charlottesville were a wake-up call to get out and do something that matters." Governor McAuliffe has a long history in politics, first as National Finance Director for President Jimmy Carter, and later as co-chair of President Bill Clinton's 1996 re-election campaign. He chaired the Democratic National Convention in 2000 and was chair of Hillary Clinton's 2008 presidential campaign. Before I turn the microphone over to the governor, let me remind you again that following his remarks, we will take questions from members of the audience and from online. But if you're in the audience, please do submit your questions on the cards just so we can get to as many of them as possible. Reporters and others who are outside Washington watching via the live stream may submit questions by emailing them to questions@press.org. Finally, I thank Lori Russo, Donna Linewan, Lindsay Underwood, and the Headliners Committee for organizing today's Newsmaker. Also, let me extend my gratitude to the staff of the National Press Club for managing tonight's complicated logistics. And now, please join me in welcoming Governor McAuliffe to the National Press Club.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. Kimberly, thank you. And I want to thank the Press Club. It's great to be back here again. I've been here quite a few times. Before I start, I do want to recognize 2 great Virginians who are here with us tonight. I want to thank Andy and Barbara. Could you stand up? Parker, stand up if you could. They are 2 very, very special people. As you may or may not know, their daughter was tragically murdered live on television when she was doing an interview down at Smith Mountain Lake in Virginia. It was just a horrible, horrible day for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I do want to thank Andy and Barbara they have been leaders on common sense gun restrictions, and they have not stopped for a day to make sure that we finally can get some common sense gun restrictions in this country. So I thank you both. Thank you, Andy and Barbara. Thank you. Well, the book is out. I never thought when I was putting it together that we would be in the circumstances in the country that we are in today. Fighting white nationalism. What happened in El Paso this weekend was just absolutely tragic. The manifesto that killer had written about talked about hatred. It quoted President Trump in it, talked about white identity, white nationalism, and it relates back to everything that I talk about in Charlottesville. The book was about racism. I begin the book with a long history. We've had our issues in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We were the capital of the Confederacy, and we have had to deal with race issues. I talk about when I first ran for governor, I was from New York. And when I first came down, and Dorothy and I lived in Virginia, raised our 5 children, a lot of things I had not really had come into my consciousness when I was up in upstate New York that I realized when I came to Virginia when I first campaigned for governor in 2009. I remember the first event I did, my body man, my assistant, was a young African-American man by the name of Justin Pascal. And the first event we went to, I was giving my speech. He was waiting for me outside at the bar, and a young woman came up to Justin and said, "You need to be careful." And he said, "What do you mean you got to be careful?" She said, "There's a Ku Klux Klan rally going on." And I honestly had not known that the Ku Klux Klan was still actually having rallies. And a couple weeks later, I was at another event, and my wife was with me, and we were handing out flyers, and she went up to the man running the event, and he said, "I'll never vote for your husband. He's an N lover." And he spoke it out, and I was shocked. And it was something that I just hadn't been used to. So when I finally did get elected governor, I lost the first time. You know, I ran on a platform of big ideas, high-speed rail, renewable energy, and I said, if you don't like my big ideas, don't vote for me. And they didn't. But I came back in 2013, and what I said when I ran is we got to make Virginia an open and welcoming state. We have to change the way we do our business in this Commonwealth. We have to recruit new businesses. When I took office, our state was in tough shape. Sequestration had really hurt the Commonwealth of Virginia. Defense spending was our #1 industry, and sequestration really knocked our lights out. And our unemployment had gone way up. I inherited a $2.4 billion deficit. And I said, we got to retool. And we've got to end all of the socially divisive actions that have taken place in our state. The year before I came in office, as you all remember, Virginia had just passed the transvaginal bill, which made us a laughingstock on national television. They had just voted to shut 25 women's clinics down. Horrible anti-gay legislation. So we got to work. We stopped all of that. I fired the Board of Health, kept all of our women's clinics open. I'm very proud. Not one closed while I was governor. We opened 2 more. Ended all the anti-gay legislation. Stopped all of that. But a big part of it was we had to deal with our past as well. Voting rights, those issues were something that were very important to me. As most of you probably know, I did restore more felon rights than any governor in the history of America. It was personal to me. When I was chairman of the Democratic Party in 2001, I started the Voting Rights Institute. There's such a disenfranchisement, particularly of the African-American community at voting places. You know, shutting down early vote, knocking people off rolls. So as most of you probably know, I went out and through an executive order, changed that in Virginia. And it started in 1901. When a senator by the name of Glass put a disenfranchisement of felons, a poll tax, and a literacy test into our Constitution. And his quote that day, "I am doing this to eliminate the darky from being a political factor in Virginia." And that's what happened in 1901. So I, through executive authorities, gave 206,000 people back the right to vote. And as you probably know, the Republicans sued me, took me to the Supreme Court, sued me again for contempt of court. I finally won, and now there's about 200,000 Virginians that have their rights back. And it's important. And I remind you that 40 states, it's automatic. It's the southern states, it's Jim Crow laws that really have denied people access to the polling booth. But as I got into more issues, the Confederate monument became an issue. In Virginia, under Virginia law, localities cannot take any statues down. It's done, the state controls it, and the Republicans in the state legislature will never change that. So if you're in Alexandria and you don't like that statue that everybody sees there in the middle of Alexandria, they have no authority to do anything with it. The state controls it. You have to change state law. I do think the Democrats will win the House and Senate chamber this year, and I think next year we will be able to change it. But there were things I could do. I used executive authority. I banned the box. So you could not use that in employment for state applications anymore. I used executive authority. I took the Confederate flag off the license plates of Virginia because the Confederate flag is just an offensive symbol, as are many of these monuments. And it'd be interesting to know that think about this for a second. Virginia's got great history. The Revolutionary War started in Virginia. Patrick Henry, the famous speech at St. John's Church, "Give me liberty, give me death." The Revolutionary War ended in Virginia with the Battle of Yorktown, and Cornwallis was defeated. So that's a pretty big part of our history. World I was big war, the war to end all wars. World War II was a big war. If you take all of those 3 big events, there's about a dozen monuments throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia for those 3 events. The Confederate War, 358 monuments. And many of them were built in the 1920s and 30s during massive resistance, Jim Crow laws. So you can understand, these are things we had to get into. And where it started in Charlottesville is when the city council voted to take that statue down. I knew as soon as that vote would be taken that it was going to cause some serious issues. We had been monitoring the websites and so forth, and we knew that folks were being told to be armed and to come to hurt people in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So that tragic day, really Friday, it started Friday night at the University of Virginia. If you were standing on the lawn of University of Virginia on the grounds, there's a mountain there, and you could see in the mountain, and a long line of hundreds of folks were walking down that mountain carrying torches. And it was dark out, and all you could see were the torches. And they were screaming, "Jews, you will not replace us." Blood and soil. These were chants from 1933 and 1934 from Nazi Germany. And they came onto the grounds of the University of Virginia. They encircled the Jefferson statue. They started throwing their torches at individuals. So we knew how bad it was going to be. And then on Saturday, the rally was supposed to be from about 12 to 5, and about 1,000 folks came, and they came from 35 states. It was interesting, last year when I was traveling the country, I went to 25 states to help candidates win. Everybody kept asking me, like, why would the folks of Charlottesville act this way? And I said, these weren't folks from Charlottesville, these weren't folks from Virginia, but they didn't know. I said they came from outside. They came to Virginia from 35 different states. And they felt they had license to do this because, and I say in the book, because of President Trump. I don't say that lightly, but he is culpable. He's had a long history of racism. In the 70s, he would not rent apartments to blacks. And if a white couple went in right after, he would rent to the white couple. So he was sued by the Nixon Justice Department. I mean, think of that, the Nixon Justice Department actually sued him. When he had Trump Castle, his casino, he would not allow blacks to be on the floor when he walked out onto the floor of the casino. When he ran for president, he retweeted neo-Nazi and white nationalist tweets that he found appealing. He said he wanted to have a total ban and not allow any Muslims into America. He said that Mexicans were criminals and rapists. You know all of this that he has said. And he created this culture that, and I think a lot of it, I say in the book, when President Obama got elected, it was hard for some folks that we had a black president. They didn't like it. But, they kept the feelings to themselves. But all of a sudden, now you had a new president come along who started the birther movement and said that President Obama was not born in the country and really created all of this friction. And then in Charlottesville, as I say, the day of the event, I talked to the president that morning. He called me. I explained what was going on. I said, we have horrible people in this state. They're screaming the most vile things I've ever heard. Every other word was the F and N word. The women was the F and C word. And to Jews, we're going to burn you like we burned you in Auschwitz. I never in my life had experienced anything like this. And I told the president about it. And he was going to do his press conference. I said I'd go after his. And we talked, and I said on the call to the president, you got to stop this hate speech. It's really dividing the country. And I said, it's bad for the country, it's bad morally. I said, it's bad economically. I said, the ICE raids he'd done in Northern Virginia, banning the folks from those 7 Muslim countries, I said, it was really creating a fear in our nation. And then he quickly pivoted and talked about the economy and how great it was. But I said, Mr. President, this is a big opportunity. Presidents don't have this opportunity often to be out on a major event, to be the real moral leader. Bill Clinton had it in Oklahoma City. President Obama had it in Charleston, as you know. Sandy Hook, and of course, George Bush had it during 9/11. And I felt that he would do the right thing. And as I hung up the phone, I felt he was going to say the right words that the nation needed at that point. And then it was interesting. He delayed his press conference half an hour. He delayed it an hour. He delayed it an hour and a half. He delayed it 2 hours. And I know what happened is I think he probably, after he hung up with me, knew what he had to do, but I think his advisors got a hold of him and told him, no, you are not going to condemn. First of all, you're not even going to use the word neo-Nazi, and you're not going to use the word white supremacist. Can't use it in your language. And sure enough, he came out and didn't use either word, and then he said there were good people on both sides. Well, there weren't. There were not good people on the neo-Nazi side and the white supremacist side. There were good people on the counter-protester side. Heather Heyer, who was killed that day, she was there protesting against hatred. There were people for hatred, and there were people against hatred. That is not too difficult to actually speak as the President of the United States of America. But it was a tragic day for us in Virginia. It was very hard for me. As Kimberly, you mentioned, we lost Heather Heyer. I got that news about 1 o'clock or 1:30. And then about 4 o'clock, I got the word that the state police helicopter doing surveillance crashed. My pilot, it was actually the helicopter that the governor uses, Trooper 1. My pilot was killed, and then his co-pilot, who had happened to be a member of my security detail before, who had been very close to my family. It was really, really a tough day. But I heard about it just as I was about to walk out to address the cameras, and I knew what I had to do. I went out, I told these people to go home, to get the hell out of Virginia, to leave our country. I said, you're a bunch of patriots. You're not. You're a bunch of cowards. The latter part of the book, and John Lewis does the foreword for me, and then he and I collaborated on the later part of the book. The point and one of the reasons for the book is, where do we go from here? How do we stop this divisive hatred that we have in the nation today? Something I just, it's just hard for me still today to fathom. And I talk about that as bad as Charlottesville was, and it was horrendous, the one benefit was it ripped the scab off of racism in the country. I think for far too long, people felt we had dealt with the issues of racism. People had felt that the issues had gone away. It's not a comfortable topic for white people to talk about. It's not something they want to discuss. But it became evident that, no, these folks, it's still there. It's still as prevalent with many people as it was earlier in our country's history. And I talk about what do we do and how do we go from here. And I say that politicians actually got to start doing something. They got to quit talking about it. On schools, we're going to have racism, folks, as long as we have inequities in school. I worked hard as governor. I put a record $1 billion into schools for Richmond and Chesapeake and Norfolk and Petersburg, because if you have a young African-American child or a young Hispanic child going to a school that doesn't have the same quality teacher or doesn't have the same quality supplies and infrastructure, that child is going to be at a disadvantage for the rest of their lives. So until we deal with education, for me, this is important. Until we deal with the inequities in education in our system, we're going to be in this place. Until we deal with the inequities on healthcare, affordable housing, we're still going to have racist issues out there. And one of the big issues, and something I really lean into the book, and I did as governor, is I reformed our criminal justice system in Virginia. It was horrible. How many Virginians here are we here? We had a really archaic criminal justice system. Basically, throw the key away. Our juvenile detention population, when I went in, we had about 700 young juveniles, and they're young kids, 13, 14 years old. They were housed in 2 maximum security prisons. These kids never going to have an opportunity. And I went and visited both of them. And I said, we're going to shut these places down. We got to build smaller community-based organizations so that these children have an opportunity. We got to give them education services while they're there. And we were spending, listen to this, we were spending $187,000 per juvenile, and the recidivism rate was 80% within 3 years. So it wasn't working. So we've redone our whole juvenile. I'm proud by the end of my term, we've reduced the population by 2/3, saved the state over $40 million, and now these kids have a pathway to a successful career. We did the same in our adult population. I added 5 new college courses. Everyone who's in a prison now has educational opportunities. Everybody gets a driver's license. Just things that you need to do, and I'm very proud in my last 2 years that we had the lowest recidivism rate of any state in America. This is important, but it's sentencing as well. And if you were African American in Virginia, you had a disproportionate long sentence. I talk about, I had the most pardons also of any governor, which shouldn't surprise anybody. But I pardoned one guy going out the door, Lenny Singleton. Lenny had committed 5 robberies. He was a drug addict. He needed money for his drug habit. He did 5 robberies. The total theft was $535 over 5 robberies. And nobody was ever injured. So Andy, how long do you think his sentence was for $535 in Virginia?
10, 20 years.
Wow.
2 life sentences plus 130 years.
Wow.
Now, I could sit here today and go through all of these different, but my point in all of this, and that's why the book is we're having a discussion, we got to deal with these issues or we're going to continue to have the problems. And we got to lean in. Everybody here has to lean in. People got to vote. And then you had this horrible incident this weekend in El Paso and Dayton. And they're reporting today in the press that one was a white nationalist, And the one in Dayton was Antifa. I don't know. That's what they're reporting in the press. I have no idea, but I can tell you this. I do know that there was a manifesto that was quoting Trump. And this man went out and killed all of these people in El Paso. And that, you know, they were going to a Walmart shopping. And then in Dayton, they were going to a bar. So the book's out. It's for a big discussion on racism. It's prevalent in this country, and we got to stop it. And hopefully the book will begin to have a conversation about what we need to do.
Yes. Thank you, Governor.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're getting lots of questions, so
Okay.
I'll just ask a couple of my own before we go through
Sure.
to some in the audience. I'll actually start where you just ended about solutions. In your book, you lay out solutions for criminal justice reform, especially focusing on juvenile justice, education. But what about the white nationalists? Because if we've learned anything from recent research, it's that you can't explain away the rise of white nationalism with just the economy and economic differences and criminal justice differences. There is something to the people. And this actually relates to one of the questions that we had about how many alt-right protesters were arrested, how many resources were used to bring them to justice, what's the status of any pursuit of people who fired weapons,
Yeah.
what do we actually do about the white nationalists as opposed to the other side?
Two questions in there.
Yeah.
Two very good questions. Let's deal with the white nationalists first. And I talk about this. I mean, folks, nobody was born to say the things these people said that I heard that day in Charlottesville. I'd heard it before, as I say, campaigning for governor. I was confronted with a lot of racist. I mean, I'd heard this many times before. And let's be clear, we're talking about 1,000 people. We're a nation of 330 million. Keep that in perspective. But the question is, how do you get to this place? How all of a sudden do you believe that you want to burn Jews like you did in Auschwitz? How do you say those types of things? So I make the point in the book that we as a nation have got to do a better job on education early in the K through 6th grades to begin to have discussions about how everybody gets treated with dignity and respect. I don't think our education system does that well enough. We don't have those discussions. We need to do that early. Much of it will start at home. Much of it, Kimberly, will start with our national leadership. I mean, this is such an aberration to have this president. I mean, think about this for a second. Every president who has addressed our nation in a major crisis, this is the first time a president has gone to address the nation on a national crisis where he is culpable, where he's actually part of the problem that he's talking about a solution. That is so unique. So I would say with the white nationalists, we got to get them earlier so that people don't grow up believing these types of things. We should have a zero tolerance policy in this country, zero tolerance. Very important.
Is that what you had after Charlottesville?
What do you mean, with the white nationalists?
Yes.
No, they were allowed to, you got to balance the First Amendment issues. Mm-hmm. Should they not have been granted a permit? It probably would not have been allowed. The permit was filed with the city of Charlottesville. I do have issues of the permitting process in Virginia, and I talk a lot about that in the book. Mm-hmm. The First Amendment would not allow you to deny it. In fact, the city of Charlottesville on Wednesday filed a petition to move it from Emancipation Park, which, folks, is about 4 times the size of this room, I would guess. Mm. There is no way you could have 1,000 armed protesters and 1,000 or 2,000 counter-protesters in an area like this. The key to controlling a protest is to keep the two sides separated.
What state resources were allotted after Charlottesville towards the prosecution of those that you could identify who had committed crimes?
Yeah, well, let me get to that because that's the second one. But so, and I supported the city in move it to McIntyre Park, which was a much bigger park. You could keep the two sides separated. And the ACLU, I talk about in the book, sued on behalf of the white nationalists and the neo-Nazis to keep it in that park because that's where the statue was. Law enforcement was saying, we can't keep you safe in this park. And then, unfortunately, the judge at 9 o'clock on Friday night ruled that it would stay where it's at. And the city had an agreement with the Unite the Right group that they would come in one entrance. They didn't honor that commitment, and they came in from all different ways. But the benefit, you say, after, the counter-protesters were great in that they took pictures of all of the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists, and they put them up on social media. Many of them lost their jobs. Like I talk about the guy that worked at the hot dog stand in Berkeley. He got fired. I talk about a Marine who was thrown out of the United States Marine Corps. So they took pictures and put them actually up on social media. And they've had a lot of indictments and convictions. I don't know the exact number, but if they could find somebody, I mean, listen, everybody was for convicting these people and throwing away the key on these folks. James Field will never see, James Field is the one who drove the car, will never see the light of day ever again, as he should never. Because at about 11:50, the park had been cleared, it was stopped before the rally has even started. Everybody sighed a little bit of relief, thought, okay, you know, we'd had skirmishes and fights and fist fights, but no one had gone to the hospital yet, and no property damage. It was about 11:50. It wasn't until this guy got in his car and then ran through the crowd and killed Heather and injured, I think, about 35 individuals. And then, obviously, the helicopter crash had nothing, you know, that was a mechanical issue. There's not anything to do about it. But they've been pretty vigorous in going after these folks, and they've tried to track a lot of people down. That was their high point in the country.
But state resources in particular, I know that there was a task force that you set up in the aftermath to review the operations plan and what could be done differently. But I think the question was specifically about the state resources dedicated to tracking people down and prosecuting them. You mentioned social media did some of this work, but I wondered if you could answer that particular question.
Yeah, that's done by the city of Charlottesville,
So state resources, the state stayed out of that pretty much and left it to Charlottesville.
Yeah, well, the Commonwealth Attorney is the one who legally brings charges. So we hand all over the data, the state police or whatever evidence we had, but it's the Commonwealth Attorney of Albemarle County who's the one who brings all the charges. Now, the federal government has the ability to bring which I think they've done on a couple cases. They have the ability to bring a hate crime charge against people.
If I can ask you about one of the cases that you did mention in your book, DeAndre Harris and the terrible attack that happened to him. It was captured on video.
Yeah.
I was struck by something on the book jacket, which I know is promotional in nature, but about trying to write a definitive account based on your personal experience being in leadership. The account in your book of DeAndre Harris and the attack on him doesn't mention the fact that before his attackers were convicted, he was actually charged with first a felony and then a misdemeanor before he was acquitted. Why was that not part of the narrative?
You can put so much in the book, I can't answer that specific question, but I think where the charges dropped, I believe.
They were dropped, yeah.
But as I say, that was Albemarle County Commonwealth Attorney bringing the charges.
I asked that question in particular because you do spend a great deal of time in the book talking about the need to come to grips with the various ways that racism plays a role in all aspects of our government. And the narrative is important. And so I was curious if you had any thoughts about the way that that particular case came about, the fact that he was charged first before even his attackers were.
I don't think, as I say, we were not involved in the suit, but he obviously shouldn't have been charged. I think when the videos all came out and they had seen what had actually happened when this poor young man was beaten with sticks and poles, I think the Commonwealth Attorney did the right thing, dropped the charges and brought the charges against the folks who had done it.
There was a question from the audience that relates to something I was wondering, because obviously at some of your other events you've had some people who are not pleased with where some of the money is going from your book, as well as the fact that you're the one writing it. What feedback have you received from survivors who were actually in Charlottesville on August 12th, 2017?
Well, we had an event the other day, and the survivors asked if, I've first of all, donating all the proceeds, and they asked if it would go to some of the survivors, and I said, absolutely, be glad to do that.
Have you made any moves on that since that event?
I said that night that I would be glad to help the survivors.
Right, but I'm wondering if since then it's actually, if there's been any change in where the money's going.
What do you mean?
Well, you said that at that night you said...
Survivors, Governor. Hasn't responded to the...
I've said I will help the survivors.
I'll follow up, thank you. But you said that night that you'd be happy to donate to survivors.
You bet.
And in your book, you lay out the two groups to whom the money is going to go. I'm wondering if that list has shifted in any way since you made that statement.
Yeah, we've gone on the website and we've put up the survivors group on our website. I did that the next day.
For the book proceeds or also for people just to donate? I'm trying to get clarity for our audience as well as myself.
Well, so I have no idea what proceeds or anything. We won't find out for 6 months, so I have no idea. So I can't answer the question, but whatever I get, I'm giving away. But B, I've put up on the website that they add the survivor group into it. I'm glad to help the survivors. I was looking for places to give the money to. I said from day one that I was not going to take a penny from it, and that's in the book.
Should Governor Northam order the removal of the Lee Monument in Richmond, which is on state property and not subject to the law that protects others?
I'm pretty clear in the book how I feel. He's the governor, I'm not. I make it pretty clear how I feel about monuments. I think they're offensive. I think there's plenty of room for them in museums and cemeteries, is my personal opinion. He's the governor. I'm not going to tell the new governor what to do. He's going to make his own decision. But I'm very clear in the book about how I feel about monuments. I used executive authority and took the flag off the Confederate license, or the license plate, the Confederate flag. So he's got to make that decision. But I think what we need to do, and I do think we're going to win the House and Senate, is we got to immediately, 358 statutes. I think we need to give local jurisdictions the authority to do it themselves. And I would advocate that that be done immediately.
This is from Natalie Jacobson with the Seaville Weekly in Charlottesville. She says, after 2 years in court, I won the right to view your operations plan from Unite the Right, for Unite the Right. In court, the plan was considered a success despite the 3 deaths that day. Police want to reuse it. All 132 pages are redacted. How can you consider this a successful plan when you won't even release it to the public to make that judgment?
I have no idea about releasing a plan.
Do you think the plan should be released unredacted?
I'd like to see all plans out, sure. I can't answer it. I'm not the governor anymore.
Right.
I don't know what legal, I can't answer when I'm not there. But I get as much data out as you possibly can. I don't know what legal restrictions are. I can't answer questions I don't know.
But you don't have a personal opposition to releasing the plan?
Absolutely not. I'd put out as much information as you possibly can, all for it.
We have another question focused on Virginia. What is your sense of the electoral landscape in Virginia this year, and what will it take to flip the legislature?
So we have an opportunity for the first time in 26 years to win control of the House, Senate, and the governor's mansion. This is a big deal for us. I talked about all the things I did proactively through executive order, which I was constantly sued by the Republicans. But I also had a record veto. I had 120 vetoes. I had to stop a lot of very onerous legislation. We got to get past that, and we've got to get to a point where Virginia is moving forward. We need to increase our minimum wage. Our minimum wage in Virginia is $7.25. It's a disgrace. You got an SEIU worker, she goes to 4 or 5 homes a day, cleaning bedpans, and she gets $7.25. We can do that. We can deal with the monument issue. If you're asking me today, I think we only need 1 seat in both. We really need 2 in the House. If we get 1, then it's a shared power. I'm not into that. We need 1 in the Senate, and we need 2 in the House. If the elections were held today, we would win both the House and the Senate. I feel very good about the Senate. I think we're going to win John Bell's seat up here. He took over from Dick Black. I think Sturtevant's seat is one we're going to pick up. There's 2 right there. We've got Wagner's seat in play, Dunavant's seat in play, Chase's seat in play. So we could win 4 seats in the Senate. And in the House, we had a huge election for us in 2017. We picked up 15 House of Delegates. Folks, that was the most in 140 years in Virginia. And so we've got a lot of candidates we need to protect. We've got about 5 possibilities with a new map. So I think we have a real opportunity. But and then we can really take Virginia to the next level. I was able to do as far as I could, but I had when I took office, I had 32 Democrats out of 100. It was hard. As most of you know, Virginians, I had to use a lot of executive authority. And I kept getting sued for it, but that's okay. I didn't mind fighting for it. But we got to get past that. And there's so many things we can do. We got to reduce prescription drug prices, things that we can do. Obviously, PLA agreements and unions, a lot of great things the state can do. So I'm optimistic, Kimberly, that it will get done, but it will not happen. And the one thing worries me about this year is in 17, when we had the big wins, we had 3 statewide candidates on the ballot. We had a governor's race, a lieutenant governor, attorney general, and it was a very hard fought at the statewide, which generated a lot of interest. This year, there are no statewides on the ballot. All we have are 140 members of the General Assembly. So to me, it's turnout. And people say to me all the time, well, my vote doesn't matter. I'm still angry about 2016. We lost 3 states in the presidential by 77,000 votes. 77,000 votes. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And yet, 92 million people did not vote. in 2016. And they woke up the next day and said, holy cow, how did this happen? It happened because people didn't vote, and Trump would not be in office today. You want to talk about Virginia and whether your vote matters. In 17, we had an election in Virginia where it was a tie. Out of what, 18,000 votes? It was a tie. And they picked the winner out of a bowl. And unfortunately, they picked a Republican name. That was for partial control of, so my point is, don't tell me that your vote doesn't matter. I'm still mad about 2000 with Al Gore. He won the presidency and we didn't get the prize. We never would have gone to Iraq. So it matters.
We have two questions here asking whether you plan to run for president.
Listen,
I listened to you talk about this on the Koja Namdi show the other day, and I recall you saying that you had planned on it, but it was a little bit too crowded, and you decided it would be better to focus on Virginia. Do you see that changing?
21? No. Let me, with the cameras here, But you know, I went last year to 25 states. As I mentioned to you, I thought we Virginia had a great message to tell about job creation and unemployment. Personal income went up 12.5%. Unemployment went from 5.4 to 3.6. Rebuilt our economy. And I thought, and was, you know, I was the most progressive governor in the history of the state. I mean, I leaned in. You know, when I ran for governor for the Virginians here, you know, it was a conservative, democratic state. When I ran for governor, I ran on a very unique platform. I was the first candidate, I believe, in the South or elected official to come out for marriage equality. That was not a big deal back when I did it, running back in 2012. I am the first Democratic nominee for governor to get an F rating from the NRA. And as Andy knows well, I was very proud of it. I ran television commercials saying I wish they had a lower grade. But that's normally not what happened. You did in Virginia. And for women, I mean, we were so backwards with women. I mean, awful stuff. I told women I'd be a brick wall. And we got all that. We were able, by the time I left office, as I say, I was the first governor to do a gay marriage. And you know, that was a big deal, a Southern governor to do it. And we were open, we were welcoming. Why do you think we got Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft to come to Virginia? We'd ended all that stuff. I thought that was a great national message. But there were 25 people running, and Joe Biden had been a friend of mine for 40 years. I talked to him a lot through the process. And then, of course, as you know, we had a couple issues in Virginia, and the leadership of the state came to me and begged me to come back home. And, you know, as you'll see from all the stories I tell in the book about my life, you know, I like to fight, and I like to do what I think is the right thing to do. And for me, the best place to be was to come back home. I've been killing myself. I've done 58 events in the last 5 weeks in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I've been everywhere. I'm traveling the globe. I'm traveling the country, helping. So I would love to have done it, but I will say this, who the next president's going to be. They have to lean in. We have to deal with these race issues. We just can't keep kicking the can down the road. We need a president who's going to unite us, who's going to stop this, but lean in on all the issues I talked to you about in sentencing reform, criminal justice reform, housing, and all the issues that go with education, because the system's not fair today.
Would you jump in once the field thins out a bit?
Kimberly, I'm happy helping Virginia today, honestly. I thank you for the question, but you know, once I do it, and listen, I'm passionate about Virginia. As the Virginians here know, I worked my heart out for 4 years. I always am motto, sleep when you're dead. I was a joyful warrior. I was the most traveled governor in the world. I went on 35 trade missions, recruited 1,400 businesses to come back to the, 1,147 businesses to come back to Virginia. Because I go to the point, people don't realize what bad shape we were in. I think in December of 13, just before I came into office, our state only created 1,000 jobs, the entire state. Well, there were cities in America that created more of that. We were back on our heels. Families were hurting, and we were able to fix it. You know, when I left office, we had so many open jobs. We became the #1 state for cybersecurity. When I left office, we had 48,000 open cyber jobs. Starting pay was $88,000. Don't need a 4-year degree. All you need is a 2-year degree. So, but as long as you raise the topic, and we'll talk about the debates a little bit, and I've been very public on television, these debates have got to deal with the issues that Americans actually care about. You know, you watch the last debate, they were all sniping and fighting with one another. They're all up here talking about Medicare for all. most Americans, it's mind-numbing to understand this healthcare issue. We have 26 million Americans that don't have healthcare in the country today. We've got to take care of them. We could deal with Medicare enrollment and figure that to get those folks involved. But the idea that you're attacking Vice President Biden on Barack Obama's policies, who was a great president of the United States of America, and you're attacking him for our focus on Trump. And that's the problem. I mean, really? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. But I want the Democrats to talk about issues. What people talk to me about all the time when I was governor, they want to talk about their roads, their bridges, the stuff, health care. You know, I fought like a dog for 4 years for Medicaid expansion in the Commonwealth of Virginia, like a dog. The day I got elected, got ready for my inauguration, the speaker told me, "You will never get it as long as I'm speaker," Bill Howell. And I kept going back. I structured it. Oh, it'll bankrupt the state. Well, I went to the hospitals. They'd pay the difference in the provider tax. I got it so the state wouldn't put up a penny. And I could get health care for 400,000 Virginians, bring $2.2 billion back a year into our economy, save rural hospitals, create 35,000 jobs, but he wouldn't do it. And I used to have Republicans come over to me to the mansion and say, "You know, Governor, I'd vote for it because I'm in a rural area and I have an opiate addiction problem. I have a mental health problem in my area, but I can't. Because if I do, I will lose my Tea Party primary." And they were not willing to risk a job that paid $17,000 a year to help 400,000 people get health care. That's what's wrong with politics in this country today. People are about self-preservation, not about fighting for the good of the people they represent.
If I can get back to the topic of white nationalism, we have a question here. Do you believe privatization, education,
Do I believe
privatization, the privatization of things like education, prisons, etc., is a key tenet of white nationalism? And if yes, what are your ideas to remedy? If no, why not? I think the idea of separating out, sort of having people being able to pay for better access to services. So even if, as you suggested earlier, we had better publicly funded services, if people can still opt out by paying more, does that feed into it?
Yeah, my overall view, and I don't like privatization of prisons. I've always worried about charter schools because I've been always afraid that those children who are left in those public schools may not have that same quality education. I believe it's the state responsibility and the federal government responsibility. You people pay your hard money in for taxes. We need to, appropriately deal with the tax dollars. But the white nationalist movement, I mean, it's all of this theory that, and Trump is sort of, he wants a white nation, which the whole concept is baffling to me. I'll be honest with you. Unless you were Native American, I mean, folks, you came from somewhere. I mean, honestly. And unless those first ships came from England in 1607, to England, came to Jamestown, Virginia. You came here from somewhere.
Not necessarily willingly.
Huh?
Not necessarily willingly.
Yeah. Well, and we should mention that because it's 400 years ago this month that the first slaves were brought to America, and they were brought to Virginia. Absolutely. Yeah. I agree with you. And we're still dealing with the issues of slavery. And that is why these monuments and the Confederate flag are just plain offensive. They are symbols of slavery. And back in the Confederate War, they were traitors to the United States of America, and they wanted to preserve slavery. Everybody tries to, read history. Everybody tries to put a gloss over it. That's the fact. They wanted to keep slavery. And you wonder why it's an offensive symbol. And I just think we ought to do everything we possibly can in a state, in our federal government, to eliminate offensive symbols. You don't want people to be offended. And there are people who drive down streets. If you've ever been down, it's a beautiful boulevard in Richmond, Monument Ave, and it is one Confederate general after the other.
Twice, this is a question from the audience, and I'll follow up after I read it. Twice in your book, you say the KKK should be ignored. On page 60, you even blame the counter-protesters for giving them attention, but their victims can't ignore them. Silence only helps them. I'll double-check page 60, but can you respond to that?
Yeah, so we had, I can't remember the month, but it was before that when a small group of about 48, 50 KKK members came to Charlottesville. And my point was, don't pay any attention to these folks. Let them walk down the street, and they're going to go to the first fast food restaurant, and you'll never know that they were there. What they wanted was controversy. They wanted news.
Right, the quote that you say was, as I said at the time, if you paid no attention to them, nobody would know they're there, and they'd probably just stop off at the nearest fast food
There
joint.
you go. Yeah. But you know, Kimberly, they wanted fights. They want this. This is how they recruit members.
But to the question, does ignoring this violence and the groups that spawn it harm the survivors?
Well, the KKK was the earlier rally. That was the one where there were the 50 people.
But another group that also sometimes engages in
No,
violent
but
acts.
before that, you're trying to have a situation where you're trying to have as little conflict as possible. I actually had gone on radio and TV before the Charlottesville Unite the Right to Rally and implored people, if you can, to stay away. These people are looking for publicity and they're looking for trouble. The less oxygen you could give them, you couldn't stop people from coming if they wanted to come. But you know, everybody's entitled. This is a free country to come out and do it. But understand that these folks who came, they wanted controversy. They wanted to hurt people. They wanted notoriety. As I talk about in the book, I mean, this is how they recruit new members. You know, you just want to starve these folks so that, and the good news after, because so many people got indicted and charged and so many people got put up on Facebook, that they tried to do a rally a year later in Washington, D.C., 20 people showed up. I mean, the movement was crippled, and I tell the story about Kessler, and he was living in his home. He's in his father's bedroom, and his father comes in, get the hell out of my bedroom. I mean, so pathetic, these individuals. Sick, pathetic. But they've got no oxygen left. But the problem is, and this is the problem, is, okay, so you're dealing with these large groups. It's the ones at home that are hearing the President of the United States say this hateful rhetoric, who are sitting home alone. They're the ones, like you would saw in El Paso and Dayton, who then go get an AK-47. And that's the problem we have today, is trying to ID, and it's very hard because, you know, these folks were legally entitled to buy, believe it or not, an AK-47. We need gun control in this country. 95% of Americans are for background checks. You know, every year as governor, I put in background checks, banning assault weapons, high-capacity magazines, and gun shows. Every single year. Every single year at 6:30 in the morning, the Republican subcommittee brought them up, no recorded vote, and killed the legislation. Yeah. If you've ever been to a gun show, Kimberly.
I have.
You have. So you know. How many have been to a gun show? You know, it's in a big, like, circus tent. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of vendors. And they've all got just so many guns. And they actually have signs. We don't do background checks. You could literally go buy 30 guns. And until we stop this scourge of these guns in the country, I mean, here's Andy and Barbara, they lost their child. I mean, the folks who waking up tomorrow, they lost a loved one in El Paso and Dayton. And, you know, and every year some big crisis happens in the country. You know it. We've had 251 mass shootings in our country. We haven't even had that many days of the year this year. And everybody gets stirred up, and we do our press conferences. You and I went to the Capitol, and they're just not, these folks in the Congress and the Republicans in the Senate are bought and paid for by the NRA. Yeah. And they're not going to call gun legislation. They're just not going to do it. So I wish the president the other day, when he gave his speech yesterday, what he should have done is got up, and he should have said, first, I'm sorry. My rhetoric has created divisions in our country. Yeah. He would have changed the whole dynamic.
Were you surprised that he came out and actually, you know, said that white supremacy is a bad thing?
So he reads off a teleprompter, and he talked about everybody doing hate speech, but he didn't mention himself. So that speech did not move me. I'm sorry. You know what he should have done secondly, Kimberly?
What?
He should have looked at the camera and said, I just called Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, and I'm calling him in. I want to vote on the Senate floor this week. They passed universal background checks 161 days ago in the House of Representatives. It passed. They have the bill. I'm calling Mitch McConnell in, and I'm demanding a vote this week. He didn't do that.
If I can just ask you to answer this question quickly, and then I want to get to another question about a story from the book. Will you run for governor of Virginia in 2021?
Listen, I am very focused on 19. Honestly, I'm not, I mean, I literally, morning, noon. I am now scheduled through, I think we have 112 more events scheduled on the books between now and Election Day. And we'll add more to it. I mean, I'm literally, this is, folks, for you Virginians, this is it for us. Because just remember this, those that get elected this November will be in the chamber in 2021 for redistricting, drawing the maps for the next decade. So if you believe like I do that Virginia ought to be open and welcoming and treating everybody with dignity and respect, that will be on the ballot, and we can control this state for the next decade. So I want to keep all my energies, Kimberly, on 19. And then, you know, life, you know, you never know where life's going to take you.
Many of us have heard the story of Heather Heyer and her tragic death in the Charlottesville protests, but you lay out in your book the story of the two troopers who were lost in the helicopter crash. And the question we have here is, not too many people know about your relationship with Jay Burke. How did that affect you? So for those who haven't had the opportunity to read the book yet, could you talk about him for a bit? And Jay and Burke, yes, sorry. Jay and Burke. Talk about them and how that affected you and your family.
So, you know, as I say, I was governor. I was also the most traveled around the state. I mean, I was on the helicopter every single day. Jay Cohen was my pilot. And, you know, you spend that much time. We developed a very close personal relationship. I used to host the entire state police, EPU unit, and my pilots. They'd come over to the governor's mansion every Christmas. I'd have all the families and kids. And, you know, we made it a family thing. Burke Bates was on my security team. When you get elected governor, there's about 14 members of the state police who become your security team. There's always 2 with the governor, there's always 1 with my wife, and then 1 driving the kids around. And they're with you 24/7. So, you know, obviously you develop they're with you, they listen to everything you say, and they're with you constantly. And they're there to protect you and help you in a time of a crisis. Burke was a real character of the 14. I tell 2 stories in the book about Burke. When we got elected governor, we lived in Northern Virginia. We moved to Richmond. And my daughter had just graduated from 8th grade, so she was starting a new high school down in Richmond. So it's not easy. You know, she was moving to a new city. She was starting a new high school as a freshman where she knew nobody. Her dad was the governor. You know, I mean, it's not good. So obviously the state police drove her to school in a big black SUV, and she went. She was a nervous wreck. And Burke was driving her, and he's trying to loosen her up. Pulls up to the front of the school, and all the seniors are out on the yard there to welcome the new seniors. Sally just wants to quietly slink in, and Burke turns on the sirens and lights and gets on the microphone. Sally McAuliffe has arrived. And I tell you, almost killed her. And the other time, which was
But
really...
then she said it actually helped her.
And then she said, you know what, it was a great icebreaker at the end. And the other time, which was really, truly sad, the last time I saw Burke. So he'd been on my unit, and they always wanted to be a pilot. Always. So when he was with me, and he would always have, which he bought himself, study how to be a helicopter pilot. And he finally got admitted into the state police helicopter unit. Oh, he was so excited. And so he came over to say goodbye because he was going to be moving the UU. I wouldn't see him because his training, he wouldn't be in the helicopter with me for a couple months. He needed training. So this was probably the last time I'd see him for a while. And he came over and he had this little grin on, as he always had this little grin on. And he said, I just want you to know I just sent your son a care package. My son at the time was a captain in the Marine Corps who was stationed in Iraq. And he was over in a battle zone, and he wanted to send him a care package. I said, well, what'd you send him, Burke? He said, well, I sent him some cigars. I said, great, because my son said you have nothing to do. You're in the middle of a desert, and at night you come back. You can't drink or anything. And so he sent him some cigars. And he said, I sent him some magazines. I said, oh, some Newsweek Time. He said, oh, no, a little more colorful than that, Governor. And then finally, which was the best line, he said, I sent him some Irish whiskey. I said, are you out of your mind? You cannot be sending Irish whiskey to the military in a Muslim country that doesn't allow alcohol. Oh, Governor, don't worry. He said, I put it in a Listerine bottle. Like he was going to be the first one to, try and figure this out. So anyways, that's the last time I saw Burke. And I talked to my son, it takes about a month to get your packages over in Iraq. And I said, did you get the package? He said, yeah, some interesting magazines. And he said, I got the cigars. I said, anything else? He said, no. And there was a little note in it from the military inspector that the alcohol had been taken out, and he was to instruct the person to never do that again. But so when I landed in Charlottesville and I went over to do the press conference, because as I say, Trump had so fumbled the ball, and I was in the back room waiting to go out, and Mark Wiley, who was the head of the unit, came in to say that we knew that a helicopter had crashed, and he came in to say that it was the state police helicopter and that Burke and Jay were dead. And I got to tell you, it was really, it was like I had just been kicked in the gut. It was like losing family members. And I knew I had to go out and face hundreds of cameras right out through that door. And I knew what I had to do. I had to deliver a message that I'm going to call out the neo-Nazis, I'm going to call out the white supremacists. It was hard. And then I got in the car after that and drove home, and I went to saw Karen Cullen and her 2 boys, and then I went over and saw Amanda Bates and her 2 children. And to see those 4 children who had just lost their dad that day, it was gut-wrenching. I mean, it's hard. It's hard as a governor anytime you lose one of your state police officers, but it was really hard for me because I'd known him so well. And I still talk to the family, and you know, I just got a lovely note from Karen Cullen's father, who read the book and thanked me for the tribute to his son-in-law. But it's hard.
I don't have to tell you, you've been out on the road, that many people do wonder why you were the person to write the account of what happened in Charlottesville, that maybe it should have been left to the activists, to the victims, to the survivors, well, obviously to the victims and survivors. Why were you the person who needed to write this book at this time?
Well, I think anybody who wants to write it should. Anybody should go out and write it. I had a very unique perspective as the governor of the state, who knew early on that these folks were coming, why they were coming. So I had a very unique perspective on it that nobody else, quite frankly, had and could talk. And then I wanted to use it. I mean, it wasn't about just Charlottesville. This is a broader book, which I keep trying to say. It's about racism. It's about white nationalism. And I wanted to bring the broader context, as I do in the first third of the book, about our history in Virginia on the issues of race, which I could uniquely talk about because I dealt with that, and the challenges that I've faced trying to change Virginia and to bring it into the 21st century and to end it. And, you know, I talk about John Lewis. I mean, John Lewis, the reason I knew John, or got John involved, is when I gave my speech, he called me on Monday and said after the speech that it brought tears to his eyes because somebody had to stand up for this country to say we are not a bunch of neo-Nazis and white supremacists. But if you were watching TV around the world, I tell you, this was shocking to people. It was shocking to people around the country what had gone on. This was a seminal moment, one of the seminal moments on race. You know, we hadn't seen a lot of this, you know, since the 60s and early 70s. We hadn't seen this conflagration of so many people coming to a state, and we thought we'd moved so far, and this event proved that we hadn't moved far. But what was so shocking about this one was Nazi chants and slogans and blood and soil. You know, so listen, everybody ought to put out their experiences and what they ought to do, and they ought to do it. But I'm glad we did because it's really started a national dialogue on race and racism in this country. And we're only starting, folks. And I always say in Virginia, you know, we made some progress. We got a long way to go, and I could speak to 50 states. I mean, we have inequities in schools in all 50 states. We don't. Our education system was built in the Industrial Revolution. There's a lot of things we need to change in this country. And it's unfortunately been exacerbated by a president who, I don't say it lightly, is a white nationalist and a racist because he espouses those beliefs and he is splitting America apart. I talked in the beginning.
Obviously, the president would definitely say that he's not. He's said on many occasions that he isn't. He says he doesn't have a racist bone in his body, in fact.
Well, Kimberly, in fairness, I do lay out everything racist activity that he did, as I say, in the 70s, would not allow blacks to rent his apartments. I mean, sued by the Nixon Justice Department? That really takes something. But he has a whole history of it. And the comments and the things that he has done, I mean, you can say what you want. This is where we are in this country today. And I don't understand the political strategy. Does he figure there are this whole group of neo-Nazis and white supremacists hiding in these holes in the ground who didn't vote in 16, that by saying these things, they will come out? I don't believe that. Women, independent women have dropped 80% off of Trump. Non-college educated women have left in droves for Trump. But it started in the beginning of his presidency. The first third of the book, I talk about, and I had to deal with him. I was chairman of the Governors Association. I was in charge of all the governors. The Muslim ban. I tell the story, he banned these 7 countries from people coming into America. So U.S. citizens would board a plane in one of these countries, land in America. They'd land at Dulles International Airport. I remember like it was yesterday, I got a call Saturday morning. U.S. citizens are being detained at Dulles Airport without access to legal counsel. So I immediately got in the helicopter, flew up to Dulles Airport. I brought my attorney general with me. And I went and did a press conference, said, I'm the governor. This is my state. This is airports in my state. And I'm not leaving until these people get access to legal counsel. I mean, the 2 young children were held for 4 or 5 hours without access to legal counsel. This is America. That was Donald Trump. ICE raids in Northern Virginia. We had 5 folks coming out of a church. ICE went and arrested all of them. You all remember the picture of that one woman. Here's a woman who was stopped for a broken taillight. They start deportation activities against her. So I pardoned her. I took away the offense of the broken taillight. So I have now taken away the underlying crime. Hoping there's no crime, therefore she shouldn't be deported. Kimberly, they deported her, and there was a famous picture in the Washington Post of her being driven away in a white van with her 2 young children hanging onto the windows. So I'm sorry. This has been a continued pattern of Trump since he's come into office. He is what he is. The only way, folks, we're going to get justice, I don't want to make today political, is we got to beat him in 2020. And to help Andy and Barbara here, who are on an absolute mission to get common sense gun restriction, we got to win the Senate. Because without the Senate, it's not going to happen. But if we have a big enough win this year, we can win the Senate, and I'm telling you, we'll have background checks, assault weapon bans, magazine clips, and gun shows will be shut down immediately. That's what's on the ballot.
This fall. This fall.
This fall, yeah. And in Virginia, we'll do it this fall.
Yeah.
Virginia, which this is exciting.
Thanks to you.
Virginia, I mean, I can imagine being governor with a Democratic legislature. Whoa, I had a Republican legislature. But Virginia can lead, listen to me, Virginians, Virginia can lead the nation with the House and Senate in January of 2020 when our new session comes in. Boom, 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 boom. And they'll fly through, they'll get passed, and Governor Northam will sign them overnight, and Virginia will lead imagine what I'm saying, will lead the nation on common sense gun restrictions.
And
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have, Governor. Thank you so much
Thanks,
for
Kimberly.
your time.
Thank you.
And here is your press club mug.
Oh, wow.
Parting gift.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you.